Hi, this is Dale Byron, and this is the Dale Byron Poetry Podcast, a fresh glimpse of knowing. Well, I'm thrilled to be here again, and especially to have you here for this second episode. I received a number of messages about the first episode of the podcast kickoff a week or so ago, and I'm incredibly encouraged by that. But today we'll focus on a different subject. We're going to focus on poems and parts of poems to help those of us who tend to be a little hard on ourselves. Last week we took on a big subject of healing our relationship with the natural world. Today, with this episode, we're going to get a little bit more personal. I call it When Self-Compassion Fails Us. So, if you tend to not be on your own side more times than you would like, and in too many instances, you may want to pay particular attention to this one, because we're going to deal with self-compassion, and we're going to look at it through the eyes of several amazing poets, one in particular, Mary Oliver. And because self-compassion may not always be the norm, I thought that a little poetry might be able to help us make it more widespread. In fact, I have some pretty good evidence over the years that that is and can be true. I want to start with a story. Years ago in my early 20s, I was having a conversation with my mother that drew a response that I didn't really recognize. I remember the conversation had to do with my acknowledging a particularly difficult time that my mom was going through. I remember how fast her tears came and how deep the emotions were in a kind of sudden way. This was not her typical pattern. My mom was the kind of person who looked out for others a great deal. In addition to all she did for friends and family, for 30 plus years, she worked as a claims manager for the Social Security Administration. And I don't think she missed a single day of work in all those years. And I remember that the people that she served routinely brought her homemade thank you gifts like plants and cookies and the like, because she was so good at her work. And she was so good at showing empathy and compassion for those that she was serving. Now, our conversation that day obviously touched something deep in her, provoking a rare kind of self-empathy, or as she allowed herself to feel those emotions and allowed herself to cry, actually. The kind of empathy, as I've already mentioned, that she usually reserved for others. Now, I tell that story as a way to kind of get into what the poets have had to say about this business of our not having so much or enough self-compassion, and how it can fail us at times, and how we can be sometimes the kind of person that has a harder time finding that self-compassion. So I want to bring a couple of opening lines of the poem called The Journey by Mary Oliver, very famous poem of hers. And she says it like this in the first few lines. One day, you finally knew what you had to do and began. One day, you finally knew what you had to do and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble, and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried. Now, I've often thought that that was the anthem for codependency. This idea that we are constantly responding to voices that say, please, over here, help me, and that those voices are always pulling us and pulling on our heartstrings. Now, the way the speaker in this poem by Mary Oliver tells it, that you feel the old tug at your ankle. Mend my life, each voice cries. And, and she also talks about this idea of that you keep hearing this bad advice. Now, one of the things that has occurred to me over the years in working with this poem and working with this poem with many individuals and groups is that often when we say we're talking about that bad advice, we naturally think, well, that's coming from outside of us. These are people who are saying, help me, mend my life. And of course, we know we can't do that, but we keep trying. But what's interesting, and one of the things that I believe is true about this poem and true about our lives, is that the source of this bad advice almost always comes more from inside our own head than it does from outside. And of course, that's even more difficult to deal with. So self-compassion, if we look at it, what it actually means, it's simple in the sense of it involves treating yourself with the same kindness, concern, and support that you would show a good friend. And so I wanted to, as we're doing, as the theme of this podcast is to integrate facts, or prose facts, we could call them, with a poetic, imaginative vision. So I have a number of these that I want to talk about, and you may relate to some of these or part of these or even all of these, or maybe you know someone who does. So the first sign of a self-compassion failure, or our inability to have enough, as we would say, self-compassion, is that perfection kind of becomes a minimum starting point. And if you think about that for a moment, you see how crazy-making that actually is. So that's one. A second criteria, I guess you could say, is that for this kind of profile, criticism is crushing. And sometimes I think of it as it's like when we have a hard time, we are a self-compassion deficit type. We have a hard time with criticism, not because we don't want to improve ourselves and all of that, but that it adds to the internal chatter that's already screaming about how much improvement is needed. Number 3 on this list of prose facts about self-compassion deficit syndrome, we could call it that, is what I call the aw shucks syndrome. Aw shucks, that ain't nothing. And that's where we minimize anything or everything, even the great things that we do and accomplish. Number 4, another characteristic is what I call the no help needed ever characteristic. And you know what I mean when I say that. Like, I could never ask for help when I'm in that mode. Just can't. I give help, I don't receive it, right? So the fifth one is failure is beyond the pale. This goes along with perfection, so that there's little or no tolerance for failing. And the last one is, I call it gotta please and make you happy. And this one is the idea that you've got to please and make other people happy, help straighten out their life, even if it kills us. So there's some kind of factual things about what this looks like, this self-compassion deficit. But I want to continue with the poetic vision, with taking up the Mary Oliver poem, The Journey, where we left off. Now, you remember what was going on. We were talking about this idea that people were all around us giving us bad advice, and we were getting bad advice from inside our own head. And people were saying, mend my life, mend my life. Each voice cried. So the poem goes on here. It says, but you didn't stop. You didn't stop. You knew what you had to do, though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundation, though their melancholy was terrible. And it was already late enough, and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. Now, are you beginning to get the scene? Mary Oliver continues. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds. And there was a new voice. And there was a new voice which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. Can you feel the power in those images? The stars, the sheets of clouds, that new voice that you recognize as your own, that is befriending you. The only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. Can you make out the poetic salve that poem offers for those 6 painful characteristics outlined that we just talked about in what I call the prose facts of being a self-compassion deficit person? And can you feel how that idea of, that you've got to please and make everybody happy, that you're sort of letting that go, that you're letting the perfection go, that, you're just letting it go. And when you're talking about this, you're saying this could be a selfish act, except that it says, the speaker in the poem says, as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. It's not about being selfish. It's about caring for oneself, knowing oneself, understanding our own vision, understanding what we need to do for ourselves and what we are able to do for others. Now, last week, for those of you who listened to the first ever episode, I talked a little bit about Professor James March, who I said Jim March and I became friends the last few years of his life, actually. And and I was talking about the idea that he had a famous quote about that every good leader needs to be one part plumber and one part poet. And I made the point, and we'll make the point again, that I think every one of us needs to be one part plumber and one part poet. In other words, we need to know the logical, linear facts about a situation or our situation or a world situation, but we also need to marry that to an imaginative, poetic vision. And I was thinking about the way I'm no expert in sailing at all, not even, no, I mean, I just am not. But I do know that a sailor does not fight with the wind. And what they do is they work with the wind. And because of that, they can sail either with the wind or into it. Either way, they keep their sails full. And this is the way I think about this. We don't try to force self-empathy. What we do is we create the context for it to arise. Now, this poem, I think, as all great poems, says the truth in a very slant way. That's one of the wonderful reasons that it's able to go underneath, as we've been saying, underneath the radar screen of our strategic minds and go directly to the heart. And in this case, why? Well, to give ourselves a break. I also want to mention this poem, this Mary Oliver poem, I've used so many times over the years with so many individuals, both in teaching settings, in speaking settings, and also in working with teams in corporate, in that venue, the corporate venue. And I remember coaching an amazing young woman, so talented, young woman, executive, sort of coming up, rising. And I asked her after we'd been working together for, I don't know, some 6-7 months, and I asked her, what was the best part of my coaching so far? And or I said it, what was most meaningful to you? I think I said it that way. And she said, well, it was that poem you gave me. And I thought to myself, all the coaching we did, and she's saying it's the poem. Well, actually, I'm kidding. I love that she said that. And it was this particular poem. She felt this really helped her. This was an amazing, she put it in her, what I call the poetry, kit, first aid kit. She had this one in there, Mary Oliver, The Journey. You can find this poem. It's in many collections that Mary Oliver has, so it's wonderful. Get it, read it. Now, I also believe that the truth is we can use poetry to help us feel and experience life more fully, to grow our compassion for others, and in this case, we're for ourselves in particular. And we can use poetry to invite or simply allow our heart sometimes to just break wide open, talking about creating those conditions where we can have greater self-compassion. It can be scary and painful to do that. It's why we avoid it, I think. I know that personally. And yet also profoundly and paradoxically healing at the same time. In fact, I have observed that the heart that cannot break cannot feel. The heart that cannot break cannot feel. And whenever we experience that kind of numb feeling, we need to allow our heart to break, I think. Now, there's a poem, short poem I wanted to bring by the poet Leonard Nathan, another amazing poet, called Kind, K-I-N-D, Kind. Said it like this: I hadn't noticed till a death took me outside and left me there, that grass lives so quietly to catch everything we drop, and we drop everything. I hadn't noticed till a death took me outside and left me there. That grass lives so quietly to catch everything we drop, and we drop everything. We are human. We are human. And as humans, we lose things. Someone said eventually we lose loss. But we are human and deserving of empathy and self-empathy, of self-compassion in particular, which is what we're talking about here. Notice the power of this image being outside and being left there. We can be taken outside where we are looking back in. I don't know, for some reason that image is so haunting to me, to be out in the cold and you're looking into the warm light of a living room with people inside laughing and talking, and yet we are outside. We are on the outside. I think that image talks about or brings home something very deep and deeper than the words themselves, which is what a good poem ought to be able to do. So, speaking about my mother again, perhaps like my mother, you are a little tough on yourself. Maybe you always defer your own needs. Perhaps you find your attitudinal resilience has taken a hit at times, and you need to take steps to bolster your hurting heart. Maybe, like me, you need all different kinds of remembering. Think about that word, to remember ourselves, to put ourselves back together in a new way. Well, poetry can provide that, I think, and it can do that again and again and again. No limit. Along these lines, the poet Seamus Heaney, who we just lost a few years ago, put it so simply and elegantly when he said, I rhyme to see myself, to set the darkness echoing. As I said, you can do this for yourself. You can pickle yourself in the right language that can set your darkness to light as well. You can create the context for self-compassion to be more likely to emerge. You know, the poet David White often says, poetry, they are words from which you can never retreat. And I add, and you don't want to. So to call on the poet, speaking of amazing poets, the Mary Oliver, who we've already been working with, but another poem that she had, she advises this in a few lines of another poem. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Can you feel the deep permission there? That permission is yours. You can take it and run. Take it and run so you can heal and feel more love for yourself and, of course, for others. There's also an African poetic saying that I thought was pertinent for what we're talking about today. And it goes like this. Those who love you are not fooled by mistakes you have made or dark images you hold about yourself. They remember your beauty when you feel ugly, your wholeness when you are broken, your innocence when you feel guilty, and your purpose when you are confused. Can you feel those words? Just let them under your radar screen. Let them just get right past in a stealth way, right past your strategic mind. Let them into your heart. Let them do their thing. There's deep solace in poetry, the kind we need, especially in these times. I was thinking that, we're deep, deep, deep in the pandemic, and there's still many questions. Positive things on the horizon, but many questions. And I was thinking that we shouldn't just shelter in place. We ought to also shelter in poetry. And you don't have to wait. You can give poetry to yourself and others right now. You can engage others in telling their own poetic stories. And of course, you can tell yours as well. And you can use these poems to help you tell your story. Okay, back to my mom's story. Speaking of story, I lost my mother to cancer in 1987, a long time ago. And it was not that many years after the conversation that I described a little earlier in this podcast today. I was living far away on the West Coast by then. And once diagnosed with cancer, my mom declined so fast that I was not able to make it home before she died, even though when I got the call from my dad, I got the first flight I could, the all-nighter from California, and flew. I was flying back on a red-eye when she passed. I always like to think that we crossed paths somewhere in the stars that night, maybe over Virginia, where she was born. The very last phone conversation I had with her, I was late for an appointment, actually a therapy appointment, interestingly enough. And she was heavily sedated and in pain in the hospital, of course. And I remember her struggling to say my name. But she did say my name. She did say it. And it was clear. I can still hear her voice. It was soon after my mother's death that I discovered poetry in a new and more profound way. It came alongside the miracle of a new romantic love that grows and thrives to this very day as well. You know, our different passions often work this way when our hearts break deeply. Often when they break that deeply, we're able to open them up to new possibilities, new love, new self-compassion. And paradoxically, that very pain can turn into something amazing and beautiful, and that we can actually become more durable and more resilient and able to serve ourselves and others when necessary. Now, I want to end with a little poem that I wrote many years ago. and it was reflecting on a trail which is up on Mount Tamalpais, which is not far from where I lived then and where I still live today. And it's a beautiful trail up on Mount Tamalpais, and it's got the most gorgeous views of the ocean and of hills. In the springtime, it's incredibly green. And on one part of this particular trail, the Sun Trail, which the poem is named after, there's this stand of poppies which just will blow you away in the springtime. So here's the poem I wrote. Sun Trail. Look, look, the poppies, they are at it again, exploding on the hills with their deep yellow flames and supple hearts. The tender green pines, the red manzanita, the wild iris, low and steady, they all breathe the secrets of the dark soil from where the poppies came. And they bend slightly to praise the golden parachutes who in turn pour themselves joyfully, opening without restraint up and toward the sun. As the black-bellied poppies teach with tender care how to close up shop daily, to forget what needs forgetting, how not to shrink from these sanguine spring hills at the first sign of happiness. As they bend slightly to praise the golden parachutes, who in turn pour themselves joyfully opening without restraint up and toward the sun, as the black-bellied poppies teach with tender care how to close up shop daily, to forget what needs forgetting, how not to shrink from these sanguine spring hills at the first sign of happiness. Please don't shrink from your own personal and sanguine spring hills. In other words, when you're feeling happy, grateful, calm, when you're feeling those things, you can let yourself just sink into those things, marinate in those things, pickle in those things. And when you are going through difficult times, those times you can give the gift of self-compassion. Thank you so much for listening. And until next time, of course, I would encourage you to, if you have others that you think might appreciate this podcast, to send it along to them. I'd appreciate if you are so inclined to write a review or rate the podcast on any of the places, the place where you listen to podcasts. That'd be great. And until next time, next podcast, take good care of yourself.